Okay, welcome, students of Human Person. We are recording a conversation that's had at the wonderful and beautiful St Fiacre's Church in Leichhardt in Sydney. I've gathered a few of my colleagues and a few of my friends to talk about the movie Silence, which is the learning materials that have been assigned to you for this week. So welcome everyone, and thank you for taking the time to do this. It's genuinely appreciated. I thought perhaps we would start with some introductions. So we'll just pass around our mic, which
My name's Dr. Christian Stevens, and I'm a lecturer in our School of Philosophy and Theology on the Sydney campus. And I teach various courses in human person, moral theology, spirituality, faith and reason.
Hi there, I'm Dr. Sylvie Magerstaedt, and I'm a senior lecturer in the School of Arts and Sciences. And my area of expertise is film at the intersection of philosophy and religion. So I'm interested in the history and the cultural significance of film and television increasingly as well. Thank you.
My name is Dr. Mario Bagos. I am senior lecturer in theology at the School of P&T with my colleague Christian and my other colleague, but I'm jumping the gun. My research interests religious symbolism in art and architecture. I teach that. I also teach Christology, increasingly getting into what you're interested in, Sylvie, which is religion in film. And I run a YouTube channel, Terra Symbolica, which means symbolic terrain, and that's where I feature some of the stuff on religious symbolism in film, and this will end up on there too. Thank you very much, Heath. I'm very grateful.
My name's Sister Susanna. I'm a member of the Dominican Sisters of St Cecilia, based here in Sydney. My main work is actually at the Seminary of the Good Shepherd. So I assist the seminarians who study at the University of Notre Dame, and I myself am a Notre Dame student through the Catholic Institute of Sydney, pursuing some further study in sacred scripture.
And last but certainly not least.
Yes, Father Paschal Corby, a friar of the Order of Friars Minor Conventual. I'm Mario's other colleague in the School of Philosophy and Theology here in Sydney. My areas of teaching are in bioethics, moral theology, sacrament of marriage and sexuality.
Alrighty. Thanks everyone. Of course, all our students will know me. I'm Dr. Heath Williams, your lecturer and course coordinator for this course. So now we'll make a bit of a start on our conversation. So I've got some questions which I've written down that I've pre-circulated to you all, so you had a bit of time to reflect on them. I think my first question had to do, it's sort of like a meta question. And I wonder how dangerous it is to start with a question like that, but here we are. And it's sort of about the rules for interpreting film. I know from experience that if I give students a chance to write an essay about a film, they'll often take it, as opposed to trying to write an essay about a dense philosophical or theological text. And I'm always a bit wary about the types of conclusions that students draw about the characters and the events in the films. So I guess what I'm interested in is what we might call the hermeneutics, or the rules for interpretation of filmic media. Sylvie, I was wondering if you might like to start this conversation off, given your background in film philosophy. Are there some kind of generally accepted bases on which we can talk about the characters in the film, what their motivations are, which we might not ever really know, much like real life. Often you don't know what really motivated people. But of course these are fictional characters, so are there any rules for making sense of film?
Yeah, so that's a big question, so I'll try to keep it very succinct, which is difficult. The short answer is yes, but so because there are lots of different ways. I don't think there's one generic kind of hermeneutics of interpreting film. It depends. There are lots of different approaches to film that come from other disciplinary contexts. So you can look at it from a psychological or Marxist or phenomenological perspective. So, and the interpretation is then subject to the criteria of that particular disciplinary framework. But if we want to kind of keep it simple on the basis of kind of just how can we, without getting too deep into that conceptual framework, some basic rules for engagement of understanding films is that if we talk about film, and I guess that's good advice for the students, we need to look at both the story tells, but also what we call medium specificity. So in this case, it's interesting because we have an adaptation of a novel, and interpreting the story just as a story, you can do that in the context of the novel, but if you do it in the context of the film, I think you need to take serious the way that the images and the sound and the entire framing of the film supports or sometimes undermines the narrative as well of the character. And then the second point is in terms of understanding the characters. Again, students sometimes assume in Alta too that, you know, if it's interpretation, then all goes. And I don't think that's the case. I think it needs to follow the logic of the film, and it needs to be plausible. I think plausibility is maybe the one criteria that is important. And actually, when it comes to interpreting fictional works, what I find interesting is that plausibility is even more important than it is in real life. So we all know that people in real life act out of character, as we say, but characters within a film should not act out of character, because we then say they're not believable. So there's actually sometimes stricter criteria on fiction, on our understanding of fiction. So that might just be some kind of general rules.
Yeah, I did write very briefly about this sort of topic. Once upon a time I was studying a phenomenologist called Roman Ingarden, and the conclusion I came to is that even fiction is sort of held up against the backdrop of the real world. And if there's this massive disjoint, you know, if you see fictional characters doing things which are, as you say, out of character, then you compare that against the real world, and it loosens the aesthetic value of either the movie or the film. Does anybody else have any thoughts about this question?
On this point, Saba Mahmoud, in an article on Alejandro Amenabar's 2009 Sword and Sandal epic, Agora, and I've critiqued that film for various reasons because it's historically inaccurate in many ways, but what it tries to do is present the veneer of authenticity, and that is the, let's say, lens through which the audience will either buy what's being sold or not. How authentic is it depicting the events that are taking place? In relation to interpreting film, I'm going to throw a bit of hermeneutic in there, along the lines of the different disciplines that you had mentioned, phenomenology and everything else. I think that religious studies offers something, especially in relation to a film like this, right, which is about martyrdom in 17th century Japan. A great historian of religion, Mircea Eliade, in the 20th century, he does, it's broad strokes. So he says, look, anytime we participate in a narrative as human beings, we are suspending the profane unfolding of time, which is unendurable for us. The same way that the profane unfolding of space is unendurable. You move into a house, the first thing you do is decorate a room.
Can you tell me what you mean by that? That's a very enigmatic claim, the profane unfolding of time and space.
Well, what he says is the earliest humans needed a ritual, archaic human beings, in order to cosmicize their space, give their space order, meaning and purpose. And the way that that was done was through dramatizing their myths of origin. Okay, so the ancient Egyptians and the Mesopotamians. When we get to Christianity, it's the same thing in ecclesiastical spaces that anchor or reinterpret rather the myth of origins in relation to the Eucharist, the Last Supper. That becomes our foundational narrative because that's what we're participating in at every Mass. It's the death and resurrection of Jesus. And what he will say, again, it's very broad strokes, is that with secularization in modernity, all the public festivals that lead to this transcending of the profane, the minutiae, folding our socks, cleaning our homes, dusting our, floors and cooking, although those can be ritualized too. Okay, Buddhism does that actually to a degree with dusting, right? Jainism. What he'll say is, well, we don't have our public festivals anymore. There are no saints' processions in the streets. At the same time, the modern novel emerged, and there were huge novels. I'm thinking of the greats, Fyodor Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, Jane Austen, Charles Dickens, and people all of a sudden participating in these complex, elaborate worlds that weren't their world, but that gave them a transcendent meaning, order, and purpose. Film does that too, good films, good cinema, and that's what I think the discipline of religious studies can contribute to how we participate in films. Like when you see The Fellowship of the Ring for the first time, again, based on a novel, right? And you walk out as a 14-year-old and you don't know whether you're coming or going, right?
And you're certainly not surprised to actually hear that Iliad is quite regularly evoked in film studies. And there's a lot of very interesting in his kind of idea about spirituality that comes up. Yeah,
absolutely.
Any?
You're making me think about the power of narrative for, as you said, for transcending our profane, mundane existence of sweeping and cooking, but also for understanding ourselves. And given that silence really is, I think, part of the narrative tension in silence that really draws you in is this priest's search for meaning, how am I understanding my life, my mission in this very difficult context. And so I think there's almost two layers of interpretation going on in that we are we're drawn out of our own search for personal meaning into this sort of transcendent, in a sense, engagement with someone else's search. But then in doing so, then it's also reflected back. It reflects us back to ourselves, which makes me think of just, again, broad brushstrokes, but some of the thoughts about mimetic desire and say what Augustine would say about the power of narrative for us to see ourselves in someone else's story, and then for that as to be almost to be a hermeneutic for understanding our own life. So that's something I find really engaging about this as a narrative, is that it makes me then really connect with this character, but then also reflect on my own search for meaning too.
And I think one of the most interesting things about it comes through more in the book. I mean, as we all know, the movie is based on the book by Susanna Endo, but it does come through in the film as well, is that Father Rodriguez largely makes sense of his journey in terms of comparison with the final days of Christ is the thing. So we see him using this, what is ultimately the overarching Christian narrative, which is the story of the Passion, to make sense of his suffering. But of course, as we know, things take a rather dramatic turn towards the end. But like you're saying, at the same time, you're, as a viewer, being asked to ask yourself, what would you do if you were in his... That's really the question the film raises. What is the right thing to do? You as a viewer are being asked to make a judgment. My experience has been that's what people enjoy talking about with this movie,
I might just add something quickly. While we've kind of touched on fundamental human needs to make sense of things and find meaning by situating ourselves as part of a narrative, maybe one way of anchoring into discussing the film is helping students to see that, okay, the missionaries are coming with a narrative, but they're not coming in to a blank slate. And that's actually part of the conflict. There's a sense in which things that typical students might take for granted living in Australia in the 21st century is something like religion is an optional extra that you can opt in for as you see fit, to the extent you see fit. Whereas Japan at the time and the vast majority of cultures that have ever existed thought human society can't work that way. We need to be on the same page on the big questions in life. And so hence there's a sense in which it's not that these missionaries are bringing in religion and religion's the problem. It's that they're coming into a sacralized political cultural sphere where anything that is different to what is considered to be customarily Japanese is not simply a cultural or political difference, it is itself a religious difference that has implications. And so I think that's important for students to keep in mind. If you basically assume the secular narrative is true, the way this unfolds can be very confusing. But if you understand it to be, there's a sense in which both sides have metaphysical and narrative commitments, and so there's a sense in which it's apocalyptic for both sides, you can understand the extremes that people on both sides are going to be willing to take or experience.
And look, I might use that comment as an opportunity to move on to the next question, which again I was hoping that we might be able to give our students some background to what they might not understand about the importance of the film. You know, one of the key themes is obviously the theme of apostasy, which is a public renunciation of one's faith. And, you know, in the film, apostasy is explored through the theme of the Japanese Christians and the missionaries who are still believers in their heart, being forced publicly to recant their beliefs and to step on what is for them a sacred image. And look, it might perhaps be a bit of a knowledge gap. Actually, I think it is for me too, so I'd be interested to hear if somebody can fill in these gaps. Why is it important for Christians in particular to maintain that public profession of faith? What is the importance of public profession of faith in the Christian tradition for the Jesuit missionaries, but even today? And I'm certainly looking for our religious brothers and sisters to answer this question for us. Would you like to, do you have anything to say about that, Father Corby?
Well, I think the first thing about the necessity of public profession flows from the very reality of our humanity as incarnated souls. I mean, we're not angelic. No, we don't simply believe or profess faith with a soul or a mind. We are incarnated, and therefore it affects or relates to every part of our being, and therefore including our.
And just to check, by incarnate, do you mean that we have a body?
Yes, most certainly.
So we are essentially souls which inhabit the body.
Well, we are a unity of body and soul. So therefore, it's to what we do with our body, as St. Paul will make very clear, becomes essential to how we live, how we profess our faith. And therefore, an act such as stepping on a sacred object is very difficult to dissociate from the faith that we profess. And I think that's precisely where the difficulty became for those who asked to do that. That their tormentors say, this means nothing. But for a Christian, it means much, because what we do with bodies is reflective of who we are, of what we profess, of what we believe.
I'll pass it to you, Sylvie, quickly, but I think you touched on something very important there, Father. This, like you said, at times the Japanese authorities were insisting this is a formality. But if it's a formality, why it is such a big deal to do it? And so there's a sense in which they realise there are moral and psychological implications in getting them to do this. And because sometimes we know they would step on it, but then the authorities would be like, that's not enough. We want you now to spit on it. And so there's a sense in which they're not thinking people have changed what they think when they do this, but they want this to be a traumatic experience that can then essentially sterilise the person's faith. Let it be something private that the peasants do in their own time, but we are in control of the public space, so that essentially the political and cultural powers that be can rest easy at night, knowing that this Christianity is not going to threaten the status quo. But sorry, Sylvie, I'll pass it back to you. I hope I didn't sidetrack too much.
No, that's, I think, all right. I kind of wanted to add, because your question started as asking why is outward expression important for Christians. And I don't think it's just about the outward expression, as you said. I mean, coming as a Christian from a Protestant tradition, you can argue that maybe that's a very crude oversimplification, but it's often assumed that we are maybe not so much about outward expression, movement, but the questions raised in the film are nevertheless absolutely essential and fundamental, because it isn't the outward expression, as I said, that is expressed in film, is in a way, it's simply a reflection of our attitude, right? And it might be oversimply. And there's even in the film, to bring in some examples from that, when the Rodriguez and first come to the village, and they're themselves a little bit taken aback by the villagers being so obsessed almost with just the materiality, the prayer beads, or the kind of, and they themselves said, like, this is too much of focusing on objects. But so it isn't about simply why outward expression is important, but I think it's what happens inwards with that outward while this is going on, I would say.
I'll just make a comment before I pass it on to Mario, which is that there's no doubt that part of what the Japanese authorities understand is that if we crush the outward expression, we will crush the inward life. That seems to be the idea. And I just wanted to remark that it's probably worth just pointing to where we're all sitting right now, is how important these external symbols can be for the germination and the growth of our faith life.
Such interesting things that have just been discussed. Who is being trampled upon in these images? It is Jesus, right? Primarily. Jesus himself says that he who testifies about me before others, I will testify to my Father in heaven, and who denies me, I'll deny before my Father in heaven. That's in the Gospels. And the main sin that he castigates severely is hypocrisy. You say you believe in me, don't be lukewarm in the book of Revelation, right? He wants that commitment. Now, there's a tension, however, in the film. If you wade through the martyrological literature, because there are martyrs in this film, obviously those Japanese Christians who refuse to apostatize, are killed. Now, how are they killed? The word martis means witness. What are they witnessing to? To the way that Jesus died in a spirit of self-sacrificial love. It's not emphatically clear in the film. The film is quite bleak from this point of view. But that is essentially what a martyr is. They die the way Jesus dies on the cross, in the spirit of forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do. It's not really there in the film or in the book, and I enjoyed both, right? So it's not but that's what a martyr is. Now, theologically speaking, in the martyrological literature, the literature that describes the putting to death of the early Christians under the Roman regimes when they refused to burn incense as a formality to Caesar, so on and so forth. From what I've read, and I've read quite a bit of that literature, but perhaps others here have read more. You have the Martyrdom of St. Polycarp, you have the Martyrdom of Saints Perpetua and Felicity, you have the Martyrs of Gaul, that's already plenty of literature. Only the individual Christians are implicated in this interrogation process. So they can say, no, I can't deny him. I can't deny Jesus. Just burn it. Sometimes the governors say, no, I can't do it, okay? Let alone spit on him, as we see some of these Christians are forced to do in the film, and they can't do it, right? And so they're put to death. The moral issue here, right, that arises in this film, which I thought was, well, now you've put us in a corner, actually. What would you do if you were in this situation? Is that if you don't deny him, priests, fathers, Sebastiano and Garupe, Father Rodriguez and Garupe, I'm going to kill these 10 people over there. And they've already apostatized 10 times over. But that's a difficult position to be put in, even as a Christian, right? I'm not saying that I necessarily agree with what they did, but that's something that's innovative in the depiction of martyrdom in this particular book. It's not in the literature. When the Soviets took over the Bolshevik Revolution, etc., in Orthodox Russia, The tidal wave came for them, for the Christians, for the Orthodox. And it's like you're wearing a cassock, you're a priest with a family, you're dead. It's not a matter of apostatize and we'll save your family. No, they're all put to death. So this is a new thing, I think, and it's something that, it raises further ethical issues, right? What would you do? I'm not going to answer. I don't know. I'm going to give it to you. Father.
Adding to that, I agree that it's presented as something new, but I wonder whether it actually is, because again, if martyrdom is a witness to Christ's death, his self-giving, then Christ himself knew that his death and adherence to him would mean suffering, persecution, death for those who followed him.
He says it too.
Yeah, he most certainly did. If you would be my disciple, take up your cross and follow me. And he expects, that they must expect persecution, even alienation from their own families for professing faith in him. So I think maybe, yes, when you look at martyrology within the tradition, there's something new. But I think when you go back to the source of that martyrology, the witness of Christ, it's actually not new at all.
And I just, we might skip to the question about the question of whether to apostatise or not to apostatise in a moment. But one thing that stuck with me very firmly from this semester, I had a group of 6 students. All of them thought that this question, whether or not to apostatise, was frankly ridiculous. They said, yep, you just do it. You just stamp on the fumie, you believe what you want to believe, and you let everyone go free. And their arguments were these arguments that we've heard from Mario, which is that, look, if you want to believe and you want to get sent to the wall for your own personal beliefs, that's up to you. But if other people are suffering because of what you believe, then you ought to recant in public and you ought to do it promptly. That's one of the reasons I asked this question, because I thought perhaps there wasn't much understanding about the importance of the public profession of faith in the Christian tradition. But look, the other thing that has struck me over the last few months is that I also just worry that there seemed to be no valuing of the idea, just as a human person, that our outsides ought to match our insides. Again, we're studying this week on existentialism. It's what the materials are for. One of the key concepts there is what's called authenticity, And for me personally, maybe I'm a bit too much of a rebel. There's something inside me that rankles about the idea of being told by an authority, we will tell you what to do and you will do it. And then ultimately starting to cause harm, do damage and punish other people around you merely to get you to force you to be the way that they've decided they want you to be. So I wonder if any of you are interested in talking about that, just in general, even if we're not Christians. Is there any value to authenticity? That's a very loaded question, but the answer to that is yes, out of interest. But I'd be interested. Maybe I'll say, why is there value to being authentic? Yeah.
So what I might add to that. So there's the good of authenticity, or we could think of it as integrity of the person. That I act according to my best judgments of the way reality is and what is good. And there's a sense in which, as has been flagged already, when I don't do that, I stand self-condemned. The moment I'm doing something contrary to what I judge to be good, my own conscience is there as the witness that my will has departed and I'm acting sub-rationally or irrationally in some way. So when we hear authentic, I think it's important to think that there is that internal dynamic within the parts of the person. But if all we think of as authentic then is just a blank check for me to say whatever comes to my mind, that's also another excuse for acting irrationally. So the value of the authenticity here is not simply that you're saying and doing what you want, it's also coinciding with the reception of, in this case, a divine revelation where the well-being of oneself and everyone else around is at stake. So that to lie about it or to act contrary to the knowledge you've been given is of the highest possible form of lack of integrity.
This isn't just about whether or not you think chocolate's the best ice cream.
Exactly right. And I think it's very important for people to realise here that if you buy into the idea that it's the beliefs of Rodriguez that is causing these people to be killed, you are buying the lie of this essentially totalitarian regime. They're not killing anyone. It's the government authorities that are choosing to put these people to death. They are entirely morally responsible for what's going on. And the missionaries are victims of those actions in as much as the people being physically tormented.
I might just, Sylvie's got something to add first. That's
Thanks
all
for pumping the brakes for us.
Otherwise, I'll just pump Mario as well. Otherwise, you know what he's like.
Okay, I might. You want to discussion, so I might slightly push back at some of those.
Please do.
I mean, I have a little bit of a problem with the term authenticity, not the principle itself, but because it has become very used in the last few centuries, about this idea about being my authentic self, and a little bit of what you hinted at, that it can be easily used as an excuse for I do what I want, and I'll, that's defensible on that basis of I'm just myself. I think what we need to, or my understanding of the human person and the kind of thing is that, and that's a lot of existentialists have grappled with that, is the idea that on the one hand we are individuals and we need to have this integrity in our soul, but we are also communal beings. We are part of a community with others, human beings, and we need to act in such a way that we also have responsibility toward, well, at least that's my take on it, that we are also responsible towards others within that community. And I think that's where this question, as you said, is important. Where does it become responsibilities for others? And there is an indication in the film that, or when Rodriguez says something about, is it not about my integrity, but is it actually pride? That is it my pride that I'm saying, like, oh, I'm this good, upright Christian, and I'm happy to sacrifice others for that belief. Is that faith, or is it pride? Oh, maybe it's not so easy.
I see Christian shaking his head, so I will give you the
I'll set you a bit.
But first, let's hear the response from Christian, just because this is, again, one of the key things I wanted.
So they're not sacrificing anyone. So if we think of the nature of the act of sacrifice is to take something and in an act of honouring the other, to destroy it as a sign of the other's supremacy over that thing. So there's a sense in which there is no possible way the missionaries can be seen as performing an act of sacrificing. They are victims. Now, who is doing the sacrificing? The government and its officials are the ones actually performing real acts of sacrifice, because what they're doing is taking their own citizens and slaughtering them as an offering to what? To the cultural and political hegemony that they have. So they are willing, in the proper sense of the word, to sacrifice their own people as a way of preserving and honouring the good that they see to be threatened by these missionaries. So it's actually very much like human sacrifice, where there's a sense in which what you guys are doing is going to offend the deity. I am going to then sacrifice these people as a way of offsetting the anger of the actions you're doing. But at the end of the day, it's still the person who's killing the other person, not the missionary.
We'll give Sylvie one right.
No, I'll let Mario have a go. No, you go.
Because you know they'll gang up on people.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're a terrible bunch.
They'll gang up on people. I know what they're like.
The reality of how complex the scenario is presented, which I think you were hinting at, is there. It's also a case that the Christian testimony cannot allow for this kind of recanting, but it's made problematic in the book and the film. I again evoke the martyrological literature. What the film and the book evoke, and I enjoyed them both immensely, is a miserable situation where people die for nothing, and Father Rodriguez ends up in that space with some hope in Christ. And I sympathise with him, but the martyrological literature, and this predicates faith now, God comforts those who suffer for him. Any time you read about the death of a martyr, there are signs that are given. Now, do we believe in the signs? That's the leap of faith. The martyr will experience fire, warmth, light, have angelic visitations. Christ himself will appear to the martyr, and not just to the martyr, but to those who are witnessing the event. In the martyrdom of St. Polycarp, as he's being put to death, and it was an inevitability, there wasn't any of this deception. If you don't give up your faith, Polycarp will kill your congregation, etc. This kind of devious, demonic, entrapment. Polycarp knew. He got a sign from God that he would die. He ran away first. It's not as if he didn't try to get away. He tried to get away, and then he had a vision of his pillow burning, and he said, they're going to come for me, I'm going to be burnt alive. So they take him to be burnt alive, and he refutes the governor, and his testimony resounds throughout the centuries, inspiring Christians throughout the centuries. And those who see him dying when he's put to death see the fire go around him, creating a ciborium or baldacchino, and his body baking like the bread, the Eucharistic bread. And when the fire, the blood comes out of his side, because he's also stabbed, water comes out, so he's an image of Christ, and they smell this sweet fragrance. So none of that is in the book, none of that is in the film. If these things happen the way that they happened, and because what kind of a God wouldn't give this kind of comfort? I believe in the God that does give this kind of comfort to those who suffer and die for him. We even know from St. Stephen, the first martyr, behold, I see the Son of Man in the heavens, sitting at the power on high. So that's a big factor in trying to gauge this stuff authentically. Do we believe or not? If we believe, then actually changes the whole interpretation. If we don't believe, that's also fine, but you end in misery kind of thing, I think Father... Okay, go ahead.
I guess maybe that helps or hinders, I don't know what you're saying, but I guess that's the question, because that seems to be the big question of the film, the silence of the title,
exactly,
right?
Silence.
That it seems, at least for us, that this clarity or this kind of divine signs seem to be missing or seem to be absent for the people in the film. So that is the challenge to finding that faith in the light of it. So.
You raise a big question there, which I won't go into now, about the whole silence. I think we're going to get onto that as well. But I just wanted to say, in relation to the act of martyrdom itself, the martyr witnesses not just to their own personal conviction, they witness to a truth, which they are convinced of, a truth which is revealed in Christ, which they believe is more important in the hierarchy of goods, is more important than anything else, even their own life. The question, therefore, before the others, who are, the people, the Christian people before Father Rodriguez, is a question, therefore, that must be interpreted of what does my act reveal or say about this fundamental truth? If he apostatizes, he is essentially saying that my life is of more importance than that truth, and that your lives are more important than that fundamental truth. And so therefore, in a sense, he is not serving anybody by apostatizing, even though he feels that he is. But by being willing to stand as a martyr, he's not only being authentic to himself, he is also witnessing to that truth on the behalf of others. He is actually fulfilling his role as a Christian, and even more so as a priest, who is meant to be another Christ, and in a sense be the shepherd of the souls of those whom he tends, to recognise a truth which is greater than any other truth. And so therefore I think this, I'm not saying it was an easy decision to make either way, and I would hate to think what I would do in that same position. But I think in many ways that the proposition or the offering to himself that this is an act of love for others is actually a mitigated love, because it's not actually witnessing to the source and the truth of that love.
I might use that as a chance to get into our next question. And look, as has already been raised, we have this key theme in both the film and the book of the silence of God. And look, I think maybe the best way to pose the question I want to ask is slightly as the devil's advocate to what you've been saying. Excuse the terminology. Which is that, of course, what that word and the title of the film refers to is the fact that Rodriguez is continually asking why the Christians who he sees martyred don't seem to be receiving any consolation from God. He keeps asking why God remains silent. And I guess the reason that I liked it and the reason I've assigned it for this week on existentialism is that one of the things, existentialism is very often associated with atheism. The most well-known existentialist is Jean-Paul Sartre, probably also Friedrich Nietzsche, closely followed by Heidegger, very typically irreligious figures, and sometimes openly anti-religious in Sartre's case. But there are, of course, Christian existentialists. Søren Kierkegaard is probably the most well-known example. And what Kierkegaard, for example, emphasises is that even the Christian is in a very similar position to anybody from an existential point of view, which is that we are on the hook to interpret and to make sense of our lives. And we will very rarely, at least this is my experience, I'm definitely interested to hear if your experiences as members of religious orders are different, but my experience has been that I have maybe once been very clear that I was understanding what God wanted me to do in my life, only once, and even that I have doubts. Most of the questions I bring to God in prayer, I don't receive many clear answers. And life is full of suffering. There is undoubtedly many Christian martyrs who have received none of the consolations that you're talking about.
Well, I don't think that's the case for those who die in imitation of Jesus.
Yeah. That to me seems just a plainly falsifiable statement.
No, I don't believe that.
I mean, there are I've recently read on an article from the Vatican News, it's over 4,000 Christians killed a year for their faith, Catholics. Do you seriously believe every single one of them received consolation from God?
I personally believe it cannot be otherwise, as they are entering the kingdom. Because by definition, they enter the kingdom. So Christ takes them there. No, we have stories about the martyrs of Libya, the Coptic martyrs. The 40 who were put to death a decade ago on the sands of the Libyan desert. One, because they were put to death by ISIS, and one ISIS member converted. That they had consolations too.
Look, that you have a stronger faith than me, I guess is what I would say in response. Look, let's hand it over to the other people. Sister Susanna?
I can certainly relate to what you're saying, Heath, and the classic question is when people know that I'm a sister, they'll say, well, how did you know? And I say, well, no, I didn't. I didn't know. And I think that is built into our human experience, is this element of risk, that just even our experience of knowing in this world is not an experience of certainty. And in terms of God's silence in this narrative, I see it. I think it's put to us for interpretation. It's part of the question that the narrative poses. But it's the question of, well, is this a sign of abandonment, or are there other ways of interpreting it? So I just put to the group that is it possible to interpret God's silence actually as God's love for freedom and his love for our human freedom, and that he really is giving, say, like Father Rodriguez and the others, this space for for a truly human act of love. So.
Yeah, a couple of things. I mean, like you, wouldn't consider myself as someone who would say, like, yes, I constantly hear God speaking to me, but I nevertheless, you know, I'm a believer. I consider myself a Christian. But and there's a beautiful, happy to share a video afterwards, but the Welsh poet Oris Thomas, who is also an ordained pastor, he's often considered as a poet of the hidden God, and his beautiful poetry that describes the sense of not constantly hearing the voice, but having these glimmers of these short moments in which God breaks through nonetheless. And what is interesting about the film is that, what I personally, and people read that in very different ways, but the final scene when he's the interesting thing is that God breaks his silence in the moment when Rodriguez is at his weakest, when he's actually apostatizing, and and I personally, and you probably have a different view now, I'd be curious to hear, but it's this moment when he's like, he feels like giving in and he's weak, and he's that kind of this human weakness and desire to just kind of end suffering, that God's voice, or Christ's voice, breaks through and kind of gives him, I think, some sort of consolation in kind of freeing him of this responsibility. And it's also, I guess, as the film scholar made the cinematic, the way it's done, that all through the film we have constant background noise. There's always sound, but the only moment where there's absolute silence apart from the voice in the film is in that moment. And I think that's really beautiful. Others have seen it as a kind of, so be curious what others think about that moment, but I found that in a way an act of mercy, God accepting human weakness.
Well, I'll just, because I certainly want to talk about that, but for our viewers at home, as they say, I might just recount exactly what happens in that scene, because it is almost certainly, ultimately, what you make of this scene determines what you make of the film, you know, in a big way. This is when he apostatizes by stepping on what's called the fumie, which is the image of Christ. There's actually two bits of imagery that I wanted to speak about. The first is this moment when, at least ostensibly, Rodriguez believes he hears Christ speaking to him. Christ says, "Come ahead now. It's all right. Step on me. I understand your pain. I was born into this world to share men's pain. I carried this cross for your pain. Your life is with me now. Step." So that is one of the most important bits of the film. But the other thing that happens is that after he has stepped, the first bit of background noise that we hear is the crow of the rooster. So I was wondering if anybody would like to talk about those moments. Christian?
There's a lot that could be said.
Yeah. Okay, just keep it short, buddy.
Okay. So I think these are related, because there's a sense in which we've been talking about the silence of God. Where is God? Then all of a sudden he comes on the scene. And it's not, to me, it's not even so obvious, putting aside obviously theological questions like God can't contradict himself. So he's not going to tell someone one thing and then say, don't worry about it. So there's a sense in which in the Catholic spiritual tradition and even the metaphysical natural theology tradition, God, unless one considers God's commandments to be utterly arbitrary, which some schools of thought do, nominalist, voluntarist schools would, but for generally the mainstream Catholic tradition, when God gives a commandment, it's because it's an expression of the goodness that he is. And so for the sake of consistency with himself, he can't deny himself. And so the idea that he would tell this person, here's your permission to step on an image of me, even though your own conscience and your entire formation has made it clear to you that you shouldn't do this, it's a long bow to draw. But I would even say phenomenologically, I don't think he acts as if it was someone who thought Christ spoke to him. So from the very moment where he steps on that, he is a broken man. He's not someone who's had a breakthrough. He's not someone who's reached a new level of discipleship, spirituality. He is a broken man who has basically relieved the psychological tension of living in this horrendous moment. But he's relieved the psychological tension at the cost of his best rational judgment about what he should be doing and being about. So I'm not even, I would say, sure that he thought he was obeying Christ when he stepped on it.
So it sounds like your interpretation must be something like this, which is that according to both Rodriguez's formation and also the use of his rational faculties, and also the deposit of faith which he has, he knows this is the wrong thing to do.
Yeah.
And so he effectively imagines Christ
It could be his own,
things.
that's right. So it could be his own voice or it could be a demonic temptation. Now this links to, all the spiritual authors are very big on this. The person who goes looking for supernatural spiritual experiences is barking up a very dangerous road, because once you start looking for those, you don't know what's going to start calling back. Now, I think the silence that he's experiencing is perfectly explainable through the lens of he knows already what he needs to do. And there are many times in our lives where we're in a difficult situation, but importantly, the difficulty is not in not knowing the difference between right and wrong, but in realizing the tremendous emotional and temporal cost of doing it. So in that case, it's not, there's a sense in which if God doesn't supernaturally intervene with a voice telling me what to do, it could also be the case it's because I know it already, but I'm looking for some sort of comfort or even excuse, perhaps, to just make this all go away. And so when I hear that voice that can rationalize it, and I seem to get the best of both worlds, I take the option, but then on the other end, I find myself a disintegrated person.
We'll hear from Father Corby first, and then we'll move on to another person.
Look, I think that the question of silence is not only foundational to this story, but to our Christian faith itself. God's presence to us is always veiled. Right? He doesn't overwhelm us with brilliant manifestations of himself. In his very incarnation, the fullness of his revelation, his divinity is hidden, behind his humanity. And even when his disciples catch glimpses of his divinity, such as the Transfiguration, it can only be sustained for such a short period of time. And so therefore, the presence of God in our midst is veiled in silence. Our incarnational faith, our sacramental faith, is such that God manifests himself, is present to us behind the veil, in human words and expressions, using material vehicles of his presence. And so therefore, silence is foundational, and therefore I think I would agree with the Christian here, to want something more, to psychologically need something more certain, something more, is in some ways going beyond the Christian revelation. The other thing that I would say, so therefore in Father Rodriguez's situation, while the silence might be seen to be intensified by the horrors of the situation which he finds himself in, God is still present, to him, and it's more that we, the challenge is for us to recognise his presence amongst us. The other thing I'd say that in the spiritual life too, God's silence or his withdrawing is also a prominent feature of growth in the spiritual life. I'm not saying this is what Father Rodriguez was experiencing himself, but it is a reality. We call it the dark night of the soul, in which, the individual is devoid of any near experience or presence of God. And therefore the faith becomes an act of one's will to believe. A very contemporary situation. We now realise that Mother Teresa, for most of her life, doing all that wonderful work amongst the poorest of the poor, was done in this state of dark night of the soul, of the silence of God. And what maintained her was that experience of experiencing Christ crying out, "I thirst," in the face of the poor. That's what sustained her in every moment of her difficulty to continue to be faithful to him and to serve him. So I don't think in that sense Father Rodriguez's experience is nothing new. No? And therefore before these experiences we have a choice to make. I believe he made the wrong choice, but nonetheless.
And I'll just make a comment before we hear from you, Mario, which is that of course what's being raised in the film is, at least in some context, a variation of the problem of evil. The problem of evil is, look, if God really does exist and he is all loving and all powerful, then how come there is so much suffering? It's a very famous philosophical problem of which there are all sorts of convoluted and complicated answers. But I think that just from the existentialist point of view, there's what's called the existential problem of evil, which is just that we all really do face this, And one good answer that I've always liked to this problem is that suffering is our opportunity to grow closer to God, as a matter of fact, not to take it as a chance for abandoning God, but to take suffering as an opportunity to grow in faith towards trusting God and trusting Christ. I think that is a good answer to that question. There are remaining problems, though, even once you think that. I don't know if it answers the problems in the film, but it certainly helped me make sense of the suffering I've had in my own life, which hasn't been the same type. Yeah.
Friends, I agree with everything you say, but I also disagree. And I'm going to say something scandalous now. Totus Christus caput et corpus, right?
We don't know what that means.
The totality of Christ in the head and the body. The one who has descended has also ascended that he might fill all things. Now, when I say consolations I mentioned earlier, right, I don't mean willy-nilly like Jesus talks to me as I'm driving or that kind of thing. But the whole film and the whole phenomenon of martyrdom is predicated upon the mystery of death, which he has solved once and for all with his resurrection. So when the Christian imitates and participates directly in that, I am now adamant, there is no silence, there will never be silence, there will only be the face of Christ. And I say this with my Protestant preacher's style, because I am convinced that it cannot be otherwise. Because of the omnipresence of Christ, he's localized, but he's also everywhere in the Spirit. What separates me from him, me, not talking about anyone else here, is my sinfulness. Nothing else. So there's that. Now, the image talking to him, enigmatic use of El Greco there. Now, this betrays a bit of Scorsese's obsession with Nikos Kazantzakis, who wrote The Last Temptation of Christ, a very controversial film.
Could you maybe just slow down and unpack the reference that you are currently talking about? Keep in mind that our students don't have any of this background. They won't know who that is. So, in the film, at numerous times, we see Rodriguez looking at an image of Christ, and throughout your filmic studies you've discovered something about this image, is that right?
Absolutely, yeah, as we've been talking, because this is the culmination of a wonderful, exciting, week with Heath in the office, back and forth, messaging, texting. I love Scorsese, I do. He's one of my favourite directors. Not my favourite, he's one of my favourite directors, and you can see the evolution of his struggle with faith from his earliest films to the present. And now he's doing documentaries on the saints in a very Catholic way, because he was given the mandate from Pope Francis himself to do so. Really true story, a couple of years ago. So that's where Scorsese, with Goodfellas, Casino, all of that has ended. Both great films too. He was always obsessed with an existentialist writer, actually, the Cretan philosopher and novelist, essayist, polymath Nikos Kazantzakis, who's brilliant, but also controversial. And his book, it's a very human, divorced from his divinity, I would say, which we would call technically Nestorian depiction of Jesus,
which is called
The Last Temptation of Christ, that in a fictional way shows a vacillating, it's not the Gospels, not Christ of the Gospels, a vacillating, confused, but, finally wants to take up the messianic responsibility, Jesus, who is tempted finally by the devil on the cross to have a family and all these sorts of things. He directed that in the late 1980s. The book came out 20, 30 years earlier. Scorsese directed it, and it was criticised a lot by Christian communities, right? Because you don't do this kind of thing, okay? But Kazantzakis, the Greek writer, the Cretan writer, in one of his semi-autobiographical work, Report to Greco, is addressed to El Greco the Brilliant, convert to Catholicism, Dominikos Theotokopoulos, a late Renaissance, early Baroque painter who did many images of Jesus, and he painted that image of Jesus that we see repeated in the film that appears to Father Rodriguez with the crown of thorns. And it's a beautiful image of Christ. You can see the Byzantine background to it, but it's now in this hyperly realistic Renaissance style, tending towards the Baroque because it uses chiaroscuro, this blackening technique in the background. It's a great connection. Scorsese is being self-referential here. I did that work on The Last Temptation of Christ, written by Nikos Kazantzakis. Nikos Kazantzakis referred constantly to El Greco, and his report to Greco is a report to his ancestor, another Cretan, originally a Cretan, right? El Greco. I'm going to now take El Greco's depictions of Jesus and put them in silence, right? And this depiction of Jesus, to kind of bring it all together, communicates to Father Rodriguez, I'm in agreement with everyone here about that's himself, that could be deception, that's not unheard of, it's all those sorts of things. But
I'm really nervous. Yeah, no.